Hyperlinker is still in its early phases and no one has a real definitive assessment on all the linkers yet, but using some of our previous Idle RPG experience, we can at least begin to construct our first iteration of the Hyperlinker tier list. Before we start, let me just say that I will get some things wrong. If you have a better rating or explanation for a certain linker, make sure to let us know in the comments. With that out of the way, let's dive in. Ingrid has a few AoE knockbacks, but her real value lies in her AI targeting the squishiest enemy. She's decent for early game. B tier. Petra gets increased hit rate and damage reduction. She has a stacking crit rate buff that can deal heavy continuous damage. A tier. Robot 99 is a supporting defense tank. He can put down energy fields, buffing allies and debuffing enemies. He also heals. B tier. Gran throws her giant hammer. It spins at the target location, skill locking enemies. She's a beefy crowd controller. C tier. Constantine makes himself immune to displacement while stacking dots on foes with his auto attack. Good for bosses with displacement. B tier. Durand goes temporarily invincible on death and his kit relies on AoE taunt tanking with heavy strikes and crits. A tier. Lily teleports to the enemy backline at match start. She's also tanky enough to do so without the risk of immediate death. B tier. Raymond can pull off serious AoE damage as his basic attack sprays while he tosses multiple grenades. A tier. Zoya passively increases your whole team's attack speed, leading to faster ultimates. She heals, does AoE damage, and buffs allies' attack. S tier. Kaka has a malleable kit that adapts to your team in the current situation. His standout quality is an AoE cleanse. A tier. Victor takes on the buffer role by scanning allies for buffs and heals. Once fully built, he can permanently heal block the enemy. S tier. Samantha can link to allies, transferring their health with the enemy. She buffs allies with a chance to dual cast abilities. S tier. Rory dances around taunting enemies while dealing damage. Her ultimate records damage received for a delayed effect. A tier. Jason is a duel master, constantly taunting his target into an unwinnable 1v1. Also works as a pseudo tank. A tier. Serena whittles down tanky teams. Her AoE poison spray is a definite source of constant damage. A tier. Deanna periodically heals and buffs your allies. She's a good support for your other support. D tier. Paul controls the distance between himself and foes, pulling them all towards him and slowing them down. C tier. Bella retreats whenever she's in danger, going stealth and planting bombs behind enemy lines. B tier. Daniel has a very high damage output at the cost of no added effects or survivability. A tier. Leonard is another underwhelming healer that ramps up his healing potential over time. C tier. Wolf gives himself immense energy gain to channel his ultimate, dealing constant damage to surrounding enemies. A tier. Hugin has a kit of stray healing and damage as the trade-off for a passive that occasionally steals the enemy's energy. A tier. Yamila throws a barrage of blades at the enemy team with chances to trigger additional blades for true damage. S tier. Sebastian is the real healer here. Every move has some sort of heal attached to it for max survivability. A tier. Marcus slashes at the enemies with his giant axe and each attack having a chance to trigger true damage. A tier. Fang deploys a plethora of buffs to your allies and debuffs to the enemies using her gems. She gives allies an energy boost after their first ult, too. S tier. Raven cuts down foes with crit after crit, and any attack that is not a crit raises his crit chance for the next crit. A tier. Kong Ping weakens the enemy's attack and defense just by hitting them. She marks a target for continuous damage. A tier. Morris is a super tank with damage reduction and self-healing. His mere presence applies continuous damage to enemies. S tier. Terra forces her team's AI to target whichever enemy she pulls, meanwhile boosting the team's resilience with a shield. A tier. Heratos periodically smacks enemies away while reducing their crit rate. He can also dispel a buff. C tier. Xu Ming is a jack of all trades, buffing your strongest attacker, damaging enemies, and reducing their energy and healing. S tier. Elsa throws down banners, increasing your team's block rate. She's vulnerable to knockdown, but passively heals allies and increases their chance to double cast. S tier. Priscilla can deal insane damage to bosses by inflicting them with multiple damage over time burns. B tier. Estrella becomes tankier at set intervals while knocking back the enemy backline. D tier. Kay has some of the highest single target damage potential by utilizing true damage, completely ignoring enemy defenses. S tier. Alex is very self-sufficient with shielding and block rate, all the while holding a couple crowd controls up his sleeve. B tier. Iris has a mechanic that once the prerequisite amount of healing is fulfilled, you get a bonus heal. C tier. Rance is super good at launching an endless volley of arrows. This can accumulate to some pretty good damage. A tier. Lee has a little true damage randomly sprinkled throughout his kit. His team-wide double cast buff alone makes him worth it. A tier. Doyle immediately blasts his target with true damage, which repeats periodically. He temporarily makes it a 4v5 while channeling a heal to your team. S tier. Dyseth shields everyone once his health falls below 30%. He sprays gunk all over the field, drastically reducing the enemy's attacks. S tier. Wukong has two passives that essentially make him a stat giant with Death Escape. His attacks are solely meant to stun enemies into submission. S tier. Charlotte deals massive damage to enemies and utterly executes low health targets. B tier. Nyadmila is a tanky bruiser that swings her sword knocking back foes. She also gains a barrier that stuns surrounding enemies. A tier. Solace exists solely for the purpose of healing, so much in fact that even after death she continues to heal. B tier. Macia manipulates two different orbs to not only bounce between targets but also return for healing. A tier. Bithia rains fire on the field with several burn-based fire AoE attacks. She would be good on a burn team. A tier. And that's our first rendition of the Hyperlinker tier list. If you got this far and left a like on the video, feel free to subscribe and join my Discord, but other than that y'all, that's gonna do it for me today and I'll see y'all later, bye.